So, we just got done talking about ethnicity, ethnocentrism. I actually previously recorded this and it got messed up somehow, and I'm frustrated. So, hopefully, I don't talk through this too quickly. If you have questions, please feel free to ask me. Um, you know how sometimes you think you said something because you just said it, but I might miss some things here. So, um, I apologize if that's the case. But I want you to use this example. um, the video is called Elders React to Twerking. Um, hopefully, you enjoy the video. To talk about these two concepts that I want to cover: culture shock and code switching. And so, culture shock is kind of like it's like um, ethnocentrism light. It's basically this feeling that you have when you enter a cultural domain that is just totally foreign to you. So, maybe you don't understand why people are doing what they're doing. You are trying to act in a way that sort of makes sense to you, but it doesn't seem to make sense to anybody else. Maybe you don't speak the same language as everybody around you. So this could happen if you travel to a different country. It can happen even within your own country. And so actually, that's why I want you to use this video, because I want to show you that culture shock can occur even intergenerationally. um, as culture advances and as we see subculture develop, which we'll talk about in a little bit. um, you can see how we can even experience culture shock, or this feeling of sort of like being unsettled, or being surprised or fearful, or just taken out of place. We can see that even happening within the same broad cultural context, but with very different cultural practices and cultural meanings at play. And so in this video, I think you'll see a lot of shock for sure. um, but you might also see some examples of code switching. And code switching is kind of like the opposite of culture shock. So when we're talking about code switching, we're thinking about the way that there are domains that exist in the world, even within a particular. Um, and code switching is essentially a theory that was developed to help explain the way that we can move from one context to another and change sort of the symbolic repertoire that we employ as we navigate that cultural context. So the the literature that this came out of was largely on African American um, who live in the inner city and the educational institution. And so what it was looking at was the way that these boys in their home life, they might have used particular jargon, had certain slang in a certain way, and there was a theory called like cool uh, all want to do with our friends. This is not specific to our city African American boys. Um, again, this is where the theory comes from. So these boys, when they moved into the educational setting, there was this concept of code switching that was theorized to actually not be in place for many of them, where a lot of them, because of this cool pose, they weren't able to adhere to the institutional expectations of the education setting. So that would include things like actually changing the way that they speak to meet these sort of formal standards of English, which I think many of us can argue are actually and education. And if we can understand each other without the formalities, why is the formality of grammar significant? Why does it matter, right? But it does, the grades that these boys were able to earn. Um, and so it's not just about the way that they speak and sort of the but it's also the ideological belief in the education setting itself. And so um, basically, this idea was that they the boys who could not code switch were sort of unsuccessful in their educational pursuit, um, whereas those who could code switch were much more successful. And of course, this work has been criticized because it's essentially saying that, um, again, in this particular example, African American boys who were able to adhere more closely to the ideologies associated with whiteness tend to do better in this society. And I think that that does make sense when we see that whiteness holds a certain um, privilege and definitely resides at the top of that racial hierarchy in terms of power in the society and who gets to determine, what actually matters when it comes to evaluating students, etc. Um, but it also, I think, has been criticized because it's one of the key examples of the way that symbolic interaction as a general theoretical paradigm has just completely overlooked structure and structural barriers. So if you argue that inner city African American boys are not succeeding in their educational pursuits um, because of the way that they enact their um, cultural kind of positioning, couldn't you say that that actually overlooks many other structural barriers, right? Like potentially, we're probably seeing increased poverty rates for these students who live in these settings. We're probably seeing schools that aren't receiving tax dollars in the same way that schools outside of the inner city are. And so schools that are using outdated textbooks that are probably also created largely by a white hegemonic group of people who are saying, yeah, this is what kids should be learning in school. And then it's totally unrelatable to this particular population of boys. And so why should they care about what's in this text? Um, Maybe they don't have home, right? So maybe they don't have as much ability to work with their parents on their studies, homework help with other things in their lives that they might need. You could imagine countless. Actionist is making this argument completely about culture, and it's really overlooking these other things. I think that most of them would probably acknowledge those other things and not make an argument about causality in this exact way. But um, those who have looked at code switching, they really have been criticized by structural functionalists in that they are they are not taking structure as seriously maybe as they need to. That said, I think the theory of code switching is still fascinating to consider. And it's sort of interesting to think about how maybe you code switch in your own life. Um, I certainly code switch in my life. I think it's something that we all participate in various ways. Um, but you'll see it in this video as well. I want to note here too that videos food from other countries. So I always think about when they eat like the candies from other countries, and sometimes there's this kind of ethnocentric approach, like why would somebody use this flavor in a candy? And that comes from this idea that like we're not familiar with those flavors. So yeah, we're gonna question why that would be delicious to somebody else. But you definitely see culture shock there, and potentially you also see code switching. All right, so watch this video and respond to these questions in your worksheet.